Our next speaker is Nathan Shedd. Nathan is a PhD student here in the Center for the Social Scientific Study of the Bible. He is currently writing his PhD on violence and trauma, and specifically the beheading of John the Baptist and how it is treated in the reception history of those texts. So we welcome Mr. Shedd.
Thank you for that warm introduction. I really appreciate it. This paper offers a sociological analysis of the ideology of beheading in the ancient world, and two observations prompt this analysis. First, interpreters have considerably neglected bringing the social discourse of beheading to bear on interpreting John the Baptist's decapitation. Major monographs on the Baptist sparingly, if at all, appeal to ancient beheadings in their discussions of his death. And likewise, a review of several commentaries on John's demise shows that many scholars have devoted little or no attention to this consideration. And this lacuna is especially palpable when compared to the abundance of scholarship that interprets the death of Jesus in light of the sociology of ancient crucifixion. Hingel's comment from 1977 that there is still an urgent need for a comprehensive study of crucifixion and capital law in antiquity, including the Jewish world, no longer rings true, at least not as an urgent need. And German and English works on crucifixion in antiquity, for example, by Kuhn, Chapman, Samuelson, and Cook in 1982, 2008, 2011, and 2014, respectively, and the collaborative effort by Chapman and Schnabel in 2015 have largely answered Hingel's call. And accompanying these labors is a host of articles and essays dedicated to Jesus' crucifixion in reference works and peer-reviewed journals. And despite the chorus of voices that has joined the discussion, widespread agreement persists that the shame of Jesus' crucifixion represented an obstacle to overcome in early Christianity's proclamation of Jesus as Ha Christos. So in a field dominated by studies that emphasize the severity of Roman crucifixion, understanding the severity of ancient beheading is largely uncharted territory for New Testament scholars. This leads to the second observation that prompts this analysis. Historians frequently categorize beheading in the ancient Greco-Roman world as simple, mild, or an honorable method of death. According to Kyle in his excellent Spectacles of Death in Ancient Rome, he writes that quick and unaggravated decapitation at the edge of town was the most discreet form of execution, a privilege for citizens of status. For a host of crimes, Rome punished criminals of low status with aggravated or ultimate punishments, the so-called summa supplicia, which included exposure to wild beasts, crucifixion, and burning alive. End quote. Garnsey refers to death by decapitation as the least painful and degrading form of execution. And like Kyle and Garnsey, Coleman differentiates between aggravated forms of capital punishment, crucifixion, being burned alive, damnation by beasts, and simple execution by decapitation. According to Wiedemann, beheading by the sword came to be a privilege reserved only for the so-called honestiores, senators, soldiers, and others in the emperor's service, and members of the municipal councils with their families. But the rest of the population, the humiliores, found themselves subject in late antiquity to the forms of the death penalty to which only non-citizens had been liable in earlier centuries. These were crucifixion, being torn to death by animals, and being burnt to death. Relatedly, some New Testament scholars have been quick to contrast the extremeness of crucifixion with the simplicity of other forms of punishment. Consider Lane's comments on Matthew 15, 12-14. He writes that both the leaders of the people and the inflamed crowd demanded not simply capital punishment, but the most ignominious form of death, crucifixion. Collectively, these comments rightly underscore that Rome often distributed punishment unequally between those of varying social status in order to maintain class and status distinctions even in death. Executions in the Roman arena in the early empire, for example, upheld such social distinctions by differentiating types of punishment according to the status of the performers. And Kyle is convincing when he contends that the skeptic and Epicurean concept of death as the great equalizer of all individuals is not altogether true with respect to ancient Rome. Moreover, it is true that Roman citizens could, and probably did, appeal to their citizenship or status to gain what was sometimes considered a more favorable death in beheading. These assertions, however, I think need to be counterbalanced by the plethora of primary data that highlight beheading as a degrading form of bodily mutilation. And in this vein, I argue that beheading, in the general context of John the Baptist, could represent an honorable form of death, but could also represent a degrading form of bodily mutilation that intended to impact the status of the individual in life in the hereafter as well. And accordingly, the remainder of this paper offers several points of nuance that accentuate beheading as a form of degradation. Make sure my clicker works. First, what the ancient world regarded as a shaming or painful form of bodily punishment was often connected with ideas about the speed it took to carry out such punishments. For instance, Martin Zimmerman explains that Seneca took it for granted that the criminal should not die quickly, but should suffer for a period commensurate to the gravity of his deed. The good lawmaker and statesman should provide for a shameful and slow end of those sentenced to death. In this respect, it is important to observe that the process of decapitation was not always a quick undertaking. The employment of swords, axes, or knives in the moment of severing a head from the body did not by default imply a clean, painless cut with one swift stroke of the instrument. When Judith, I know it's a little bit morbid, so I'll try to say it with a smile on my face. When Judith beheaded Holofernes, the text claims that she struck into his neck twice in her strength and took off his head from him. The prepositional phrase "ente iscui autes," in her strength, in 13:8, reflects either the perception that the severing, even in 2 blows, required a great measure of strength, that is, in her strength, or 2, it reflects something along the lines of a patriarchal perspective that Judith, in her strength as a female, that is, in her strength, had to strike the neck more than once. Regardless, both of these options further highlight that beheading did not necessarily occur with ease. As a further example, Epictetus mentions a man whom Emperor Nero ordered to be beheaded, who had to offer his neck a second time because the first blow did not achieve its purpose. The text reads that the man stretched out his neck and received the blow, but as it was a feeble one, he shrank back for an instant and then stretched out his neck again. One could, of course, argue that the number of strokes it took to cut off a head was not the primary factor in estimating its severity, even if some executioners paused for inordinate amounts of time between strokes. My brother-in-law, let me be a little bit anecdotal here. My brother-in-law recently got hired by the FBI, and they had to do background checks on the entire family. So I've been really careful on how I Google all of this stuff here recently, because I want to be able to go back home to the U.S. here recently. So if anyone asks, I'm an upstanding citizen. So, but instead, it is the speed of beheading in comparison to other forms of torture that influence conceptualizations of its severity. The mother of Artaxerxes once objected to the king regarding his command to have a certain man beheaded, and she is quoted as saying, "O king, do not let this accursed man off so easily, but leave him to me, and he shall receive the fitting reward for his daring words." Upon the mother's appeal, the executioners instead rack the man on a wheel for a duration of 10 days, gouge out his eyes, and then pour molten brass into his ears until he dies. The mother's comment does not reveal that beheading lacked severity entirely, only that it was not a severe enough penalty. However, it is interesting to note that in many cases the process of beheading was a long drawn-out affair because it was combined with other forms of punishment. For example, Plutarch, Polybius, Diodorus of Sicily, Dionysius of Halicarnassus, Appian, and Livy all narrate certain beheadings that occurred in combination with floggings. And in addition to flogging, beheading could be combined with crucifixion or impalement, dragging, or the dismemberment and mutilation of other parts of the body. Second, decapitation was not universally recognized as an unaggravated form of execution in the ancient Roman world. Following crucifixion and burning someone alive, Callistratus includes beheading in his list of summa supplicia, and likewise the sentences of Paulus indicates crucifixion, burning, and beheading as the summa supplicia. Third, Rome could behead or have beheaded its own citizens of high social status with the intent of dishonoring them. As one example, Emperor Claudius once sentenced a Roman tribune named Celer to beheading, and Josephus describes the sentencing in his Jewish War. He writes that Celer he sent back to Jerusalem in chains and directed that he be handed over to the Judeans for torture, and that after he had been dragged around the city, in this way his head be hacked off. Commenting on this text, Mason rightly observes the implication that the adverb huto in this way makes explicit. This beheading, after torture and humiliation by foreigners, following the months-long journey back to Judea in anticipation, would be an extreme form of degradation for the tribune. As another example, Appian's comments on the beheading of two Roman generals presupposes that their identity as Roman generals could have led them to being spared of their fate. The text reads that Sulla did not spare them because they were Romans, but killed them both and sent their heads to Lucretius to be displayed round the walls. Again, rather than this text presupposing that decapitation was a privilege reserved for Romans, it presupposes the inverse, namely that their identity as Romans elicited the expectation that they could have been spared. Fourth, and relatedly, Rome did not reserve decapitation for its elite citizens exclusively. Non-citizens, of course, could be beheaded, and significantly, without this punishment, regarded as an honor, as if they were being treated above their station. In his account of the death of Antigonus, Josephus cites Strabo, who expresses that Antony's decision to behead Antigonus the Jew emanated directly from the need to disgrace Antigonus's memory. Relatedly, Romans could criticize authorities for beheading people of high social status, thus revealing that, for whatever reason, beheading was not necessarily appropriate for someone of that stature. For instance, Cicero criticizes Varus, the governor of Sicily, because Varus had men of high rank and stainless character actually beheaded. Fifth, even if the Roman Empire, Fifth, even if the Roman Empire carried out certain beheadings with the intent of minimizing the shame that the victim faced, this did not preclude that others would perceive it through the filter of shame. A brief discussion of a rabbinic text, I think, is illuminating in this regard. Mishnah Sanhedrin 7:3 details that decapitation was carried out in this way in the Jewish court. They would cut off his head with a sword, just as the government does. But Rabbi Judah says this is disgusting, but they should put his head on a block and chop it off with an axe. They said to him, "There is no form of death more disgusting than this one." Berkowitz utilizes this text as a primary piece of evidence to bolster her thesis that the Jewish experience of Roman execution influenced rabbinic laws of execution. Berkowitz cogently contends that the respective disputants, the sages on the one hand and Rabbi Judah on the other, each wished to protect the criminal's body from indignity as best as possible. She reasons that if the sages were concerned to preserve the criminal's dignity, then they chose well regarding Roman execution, adopting its most honorable method. Although her discussion is full of insight, it must be emphasized that what the sages prescribe as the proper method of carrying out beheading is perceived by another, Rabbi Judah, as most disgraceful, and vice versa. Put differently, even if the execution by beheading was carried out in some ancient circles with the intent of safeguarding the victim's sense of dignity, This intention did not necessarily exclude the possibility that others would perceive the execution through the lens of shame. With these 5 considerations in mind, we should be careful not to jump to the conclusion that beheading was void of dishonor, that it constituted an ideal manner of death, or that the privilege of decapitation was always equivalent to an honorable death. Rather, beheading could represent one's preferred manner of death on occasion, especially when confronted with what is perceived to be a more severe alternative. Thus, we're not dealing with a spectrum from dishonorable to honorable, but with varying degrees of degradation. Before closing, another way that the primary data accentuate the severity of beheading deserves its own discussion. Beheading held the potential to humiliate the victim not only at the moment of death, but also beyond death into the afterlife. Now, the importance of properly disposing the dead in the ancient world is a well-known truism that does not bear repeating here, and nor is it necessary here to set forth a comprehensive analysis of the various ancient beliefs about death, burial, and life after death. They are indeed quite various. Important for present purposes is that some beliefs about the nature of life after death motivated the anxiety to properly dispose of the dead. As Metcalf and Huntington explain, life becomes transparent against the background of death, and fundamental social and cultural issues are revealed. Indeed, one such social and cultural issue that mortuary rituals reveal specifically in the Greek and Roman worlds is that many people believed they could influence how their soul or body fared in the afterlife. As one writer puts it, quote, "In Rome, as in many other societies, tombs were often equipped with goods which would make the dead person's life after death more pleasant. Toys for children, mirrors and cosmetics for women, dice and drinking cups for men," end quote. Significantly, therefore, when the living did not bury the dead, they prevented the dead from possessing a favorable transition into life hereafter. After his death, as is well known, the spirit of Patroclus visited Achilles as the latter slept, beseeching Achilles to bury him in speed so that he may pass within the gates of Hades. And Patroclus was thus unable to join the other dead on the other side of the river until he had been buried. In his satires, Juvenal describes a man whose body was crushed by a wagon full of rocks, and no trace of remaining limbs or bones were found. And accordingly, Juvenal writes that the man is already a newcomer, sitting on the bank, shuddering at the hideous ferryman. The wretched man has no hopes of a bark across the muddy torrent because he doesn't have a coin in his mouth to offer. Similarly, Virgil recounts that the ferryman is not able to transport the unburied dead across the banks of the waters until their bones have found a resting place. In such contexts where properly burying the dead was a vital social requirement and a factor in the social status of the deceased in the afterlife, beheading could be perceived as interrupting normal mortuary practices surrounding the deceased and tarnishing the social status of the victim past the point of death. In this respect, it is important to emphasize that beheading was not always, strictly speaking, a method of execution in the ancient world. The ancients frequently beheaded those who had already died and cast away their heads or bodies unburied as food for birds or food for fish if the bodies or heads were cast in a river. Such corpse abuse violated the integrity of the body and prevented, if the head was consumed by wild animals, it prevented or interfered with the proper disposal of the corpse. Lucan's description of Sulla's prescriptions in the aftermath of the battle at the Colline Gate connects the quest to reunite the severed head and the headless body with the intent to properly dispose of the dead. In short, the separation of the head from its body represented an obstacle to such intentions. Further, according to Asconius' 1st century CE commentary on Cicero, Catiline cut off the head of Marcus Marius and carried it throughout the city of Rome. Henard thinks that the bodily mutilation of Marcus was intended to deprive the enemy of all status in the world of the dead. And in the same way, Henard interprets the other decapitations during the prescriptions of Sulla. And these beheadings involved the public exhibition of the severed heads to the point where they lost their facial features, their recognition, and therefore their status in the afterlife. As Aldhouse Green explains, she writes that decapitation is symbolically important. Heads are essentially linked with identity, and despoiling a corpse, and particularly robbing it of its head, may be perceived to prevent proper burial and reincorporation in the next world. Indeed, some images of life hereafter involve the idea that the dead carried with them into the afterlife the physical wounds and shame from their moments of death. In his excellent discussion of ancient Greek views of life in Hades, Garland vividly describes fallen warriors as eternally blood-bespattered. And Kyle argues that many in the ancient Greco-Roman world thought that the soul retained the marks and mood from the moment of death. As an example of the dead maintaining the wounds from their death, consider Virgil's portrayal of Aeneas in the region of the underworld known as the Fields of Mourning. The Trojan sees a certain Eriphyle pointing to the wounds that her cruel son had dealt her. And the Trojan also sees a certain Dido with wound still fresh. Furthermore, when Aeneas had initially crossed the river, he immediately heard the cries of infants who had prematurely died, and in the next stage of his journey, he noticed the souls of those who had taken their own life. This belief that mutilating the body could affect the victim in the afterlife, I think, finds clear expression in a 2nd century CE anonymous papyrus text from Egypt, a papyrus that Garland describes as offering the grisliest description of the underworld to come down to us from antiquity. 2 observations, and I have the text on the projector. 2 observations about this text are in order. First, the visitor to the underworld notices beheaded corpses, thus exemplifying perhaps a belief that the dead retained a recognizable form of existence that bore the marks of mutilation they received in the moments of their deaths. Something about the dead's appearance made the manner of their death not only perceptible to the visitor, but also distinguishable from other types of mutilated corpses. He also mentions those that were crucified. Those that were beheaded in death thus retained such a mutilated existence beyond death. Second, the text notes that the corpses were the subject of continued mockery because of the manner of their death. Thus, those that were beheaded in death also retained the shame associated with beheading beyond death. At the beginning of this paper, we highlighted the fact that many interpreters have neglected to bring the social discourse of beheading to bear on interpreting traditions of John's death. Given my contention that the separation of the head from the body could be understood as a means to interrupt normal mortuary practices, this lacuna, I think, needs to be filled moving forward. In what are perhaps our earliest written traditions of the Baptist demise, Mark and Matthew both frame John's beheading around this idea that decapitation affects what would otherwise be normal burial. Mark 6:28 specifies that John's bodiless head became food on a platter and was given to the Herodian women, but John's headless body, taptoma, however, remained separate from his head and given to John's disciples and placed in a tomb. Likewise, Matthew 14 juxtaposes the fates of John's head and body. The former became food on a platter and given to the Herodian women, and the latter was taken by John's disciples and buried. Thank you.
Question from Nate.
I was scared you were going to ask one.
It's really good. It's really interesting. I love that. The headless body of John the Baptist was buried. Yeah, that's great. Just in terms of the degradation and things that could happen ahead of decapitation, of course, in Mark 6, it's immediately Antipas goes out and, he's killed immediately and his head is brought up. So it does imply it's quick. And,
Right.
And in this case, John doesn't suffer any additional.
Right. Yeah. This one, in my opinion, is more framed around the idea that the head and the body were separated, around this idea of interrupting normal burial practices. But yeah, we don't get a snapshot into the actual moment of execution. It's just sort of a summary statement. But as you say, it is portrayed as quick.
Wine glasses on the banquet, get John, and and there he is. His head comes up quick.
Yeah, very quick narrative.
Because that plays into the characterization of Antipas as not really wanting to harm John, really quite liking him. It's all about the evil women.
Yeah, in Mark's portrayal at least, right? Yeah.
Mark's, and it is a story.
Right.
Ross Kramer has done a wonderful analysis
Mm-hmm.
of what's going on there in terms of the construction of that story. But yeah, so it's part of the characterization of Antipas really quite liking John that he's then swiftly beheaded.
Yeah, that's interesting. Yeah. No, I don't have anything to add to that. No, that's good.
Why didn't they use the Socratic method, hemlock? The Romans, did we follow up on that? I just wondered.
I honestly do not know. So, I do not know.
Thanks for that. It seems to me you're really on the right track when you are thinking about not the swiftness of death, which
Mm-hmm.
is probably relative. I mean, certainly
Right.
faster than crucifixion or burning, but rather the degradation of the body. And it makes me think of the British Museum. If you look at the Assyrian reliefs of the Battle of Lachish and other sieges, there are images of beheading, also impaling, throwing people off ramparts and so forth. There was a display maybe 3 or 4 years ago in the museum about the construction of the body in classical antiquity, and they used the Assyrian reliefs as a kind of counter image to the way in which the body was treated in Greece, where the bodily integrity is a high value, right? You always see these beautiful bodies. And it's an interesting article in Journal of Roman Studies by Tonio Kosher
Yeah.
on the
Images of war.
exactly,
Yeah.
where bodies in pictures of hoplite battles, bodies are not penetrated. And so the Assyrian reliefs of beheading and impaling are really a strong kind of counterpoint to that. And so the beheading and the separation of the body, the head from the body, really seems to be more on the kind of Assyrian side of what you do with the body of an enemy, because it has probably little to do with the swiftness of death and everything to do with the separation of the head from the body. And you get these pictures of a whole bunch of heads on the ground.
Or in somebody's hand.
Yeah.
Yeah, that's right. So,
Yeah,
and passing the head around at dinner,
Yeah.
No, so when you were talking, I was also thinking of these beheadings by Daesh, which caused such revulsion, I think, among Western people that this is not what you do with a prisoner, right? It's a really horrific mode of death. There's something about the anthropology of the human body that separating the head, there's something really fundamentally wrong.
Yeah, Regina Janes talks about that, the face being the locus of multiple senses, right? Touch, sight, smell. It's where we learn who we are in face-to-face encounters. So there's something just intrinsically disturbing about separating the head from the body. Yeah, and there's also those Assyrian images that you're referring to. I mean, Trajan's Column, of course.
The Romans start doing it.
The Romans do it as well. And then on the Antonine Wall, Hadrian's Wall, in 2005, there was a stone slab discovered by the University of Manchester's archaeological unit that depicts a horse cavalryman carrying the head of a barbarian, evidently. And the inscription uses sort of this superior language, referring to the cavalryman as a victor. So there is this idea of beheading, casting people in a superior-inferior relationship. Yeah.
And then we'll go to the open discussion. We can keep going.
Yeah.
Thank you. I'm just wondering, is there any archaeological evidence of decapitation and the bones of somebody being decapitated being treated in a different way? What I'm just wondering is, in terms of secondary burial in Judaism in the 1st century, where, okay, obviously once the body is decomposed, bones go into
Right.
an ossuary, but I don't know enough about it, but my impression is that you could get multiple people's bones put
Mhm.
into the same ossuary, which
Yeah.
would suggest perhaps that
Mhm.
after decomposition, the actual way in which bodies were treated might not be as careful or concerned. People may not be as concerned with it as they were initially, as the texts
Yeah.
you presented suggested.
Yeah, there is evidence of decapitated inhumations in this country, in early Roman Britain. There's a steady stream of scholarship that tries to understand this idea of where they've analyzed the bones and they've noticed that people were post-mortem, after they've died, their head was severed from their body and the head was placed in an anatomically different position than what is normal. And interesting, there's sort of one stream of scholars that interprets this sort of along the lines that I've emphasized here, that of sort of interrupting normal burial, sort of interrupting people being reincorporated into the next world. But there's also another stream of scholars that say that this is a way of actually aiding people's transition to the underworld. If the soul resided in the head, then releasing the head is a way of releasing the soul.
Maybe it was just teenagers being pranksters.
That might be. That might be. But also that evidence too. There's a ton of them out there of decapitated inhumations. The evidence also supports the fact that beheading did not necessarily occur in one swift stroke. So there's multiple cuts on bones. Yeah. I was in a dark place for a while researching this. I'm slowly emerging and seeing the
The
light.
monastery at Marsaba has the heads of about 600 monks who were killed by the Persians, and it's just the skulls, right? So it there becomes a kind of object of veneration. The bones are somewhere else, but you're basically seeing all of your monastic brothers, grinning at you.
Join us in. I promised Sarah actually the first question in the open discussion.
It's more of a comment, a little bit peripheral, but I think will help you with the argument about degradation, and that is the practice of decapitating statues is a thing. And also of removing faces in frescoes. And the example that comes to mind for that is in Egypt, Queen Hatshepsut. When I think her son came to power, he went through and scratched all of her faces off. So there's only a few places where her representation is left, but it's totally clear that the removal of the head, and also with statues as well, intentional decapitation is dishonoring intentionally.
Well, and just thinking in terms of Hebrew Bible, the statue of the image of Dagon falling before Yahweh, and the hand and the head lying separate. And also Batman versus Superman, the movie. I think Superman's head is cut off. The statue. I might be wrong.
I've seen it. I'll have to go back. I'll look for that.
No, that's good. Okay.
Jamie and Michelle.
Follow that. About your interpretation of Batman versus Superman, you may be getting to this in the wider project, but have you looked at the effects on the living of these particular ways of execution? So, crucifixion or beheading as a warning to those who live on not to mess with us, or the wider social implications, not just the effect on the victim, but the wider society.
Yeah, absolutely. In a lot of respects, I think it overlaps in a lot of significant ways with the social function of crucifixion, that of preventing the leader of a revolt or insurgency from
Sparking something.
Yeah, from sparking something else. And the obvious reference that comes to mind would be King Herod's slave Simon, who sought to put the diadem on his head, and then in the next breath, Josephus says that he got his head cut off. So yeah, there's tons of evidence for that, and there's tons of evidence too that emphasizes the public nature of beheading, not only at the moment of execution, but of course in the post-mortem public display of the head being put up on the high places of a wall. This is a way of frightening people, turning them to stone, like Medusa's head does, right?
So just to come back with John's, it's interesting because it's done in private, and it's just this private. Okay, it's semi-private.
It's semi-private.
It's a party.
The moment of execution.
But there's no public display of John's head as a warning to everybody. not been aware of.
On a platter, a relatively public beheading on a platter. But then the disciples are, I guess, made aware of the manner of John's death because they're allowed to take the body. But no,
Do you read the slicing of the high priest's ear in the Gethsemane narrative as an attempted beheading?
in terms of the language used, maybe. Well, I mean, if you try to behead someone, perhaps the natural instinct is to duck, and so you think, instead of getting hit in the neck, you got hit in the ear or something like that.
Or
But
maybe
he-
Peter was just a swordsman.
But he cuts it off, right? Which means you have to probably come from the top.
Well, did he cut the entire thing off, or did he just
Well-
sever it in half, and got the
That's
bottom part?
conversation.
This is an interpretation of that passage that it was an attempted beheading. That Peter was attempting
Interesting.
to behead the high priest. He wasn't trying to cut his ear off. He was trying to cut his head off. I jumped on Michelle.
No, I do hope you like my hand and movies. Very really seriously, you need some bolts with a guy's head doesn't get quite cut off and goes around cutting everybody else's head off. So I just wanted to ask, you're going to be more expert on this. This is brilliant. I guess I need to answer this, and then because it's through the lens of Revelation, because that's all I know about. I then wonder if I could ask Sarah a question as well afterwards from the same perspective. So in Revelation 20 verse 4, do you deal with this where it's Pelekizo
Yeah, Pelekizo.
and those who have been beheaded or with an axe, they're the first to be resurrected
Right.
in
Right.
the resurrection of the dead. So the great white throne appears. First and foremost, those who have been beheaded for the witness of Jesus, the testimony of Jesus. So, as Revelation is a text about persecution, martyrdom, or you would argue it's like arguing that you should really be a proto-martyr, Jesus is proto-martyr, you should martyr yourself.
Right.
What do you, I was surprised you mentioned that because it kind of supports what you're arguing and then some.
Yeah. There's this idea that I guess violent events are naturally events where you either vilify someone or you cast them as a hero or a conqueror. So there's this sort of flipping of the script that is going on. I do mention that text briefly, like a footnote in my chapter, but no, I haven't dealt with it extensively, so I don't have.
I just wondered because Revelation is all about like how nasty can it get, and if it's nastier for you, you get a better place and you come back. So the point is the people that are beheaded, they've had the worst time of it. So it's the souls under the altar in chapter 6. How long? How long? The answer is soon, soon, soon. And then however worse it is for you, you are better, better, better.
Yeah.
So if you're the first to come back, okay, you're not 144,000, but to have that specific usage, it is using a really interesting lens there. But I know nobody likes it. So I wanted to ask Sarah if that's okay.
Only as pastiche.
Well, that's obvious. In relation to the kind of suffering persecution lens for bringing everything together, I just wondered, because of the network theory, I like the idea and I think it makes sense conceptually, but how does it stop? So I go along and I'm from Ephesus and I say, hey guys, it's been really difficult, the guild didn't like me very much. And then I go along from somewhere and I meet someone from somewhere else and they're like, well, 4 of our congregation were killed last week. So, FYI, it's a bit worse for us. Does it have a potential for competition of who's getting the worst time rather than a social cohesion, but actually a separation of groups of like, well, the people down the road, they're not being Jesus-y enough because they're just having a bit of a difficult time with their meal time?
Yes. So I love the idea of competitive suffering. This is a great session. I definitely think that it could be because, I mean, if this is a practice, why couldn't it be a competitive practice like other competitive practice? I mean, I talked about the sort of spiritual gifts as competitive practicing. The thing about networks, I don't actually know if there are any real connections between these groups, or if Paul just really wants there to be, other than he and his companions. So I'm thinking about this like meta discourse where it's in their imagination that he's letting them know that there are these other groups out there, and they know within their own group that baptism is an odd thing, and he's telling them that they're doing it wrong, and he's telling them they're doing the Lord's Supper wrong. But he's got this like general notion of sort of what it means to be part of this group, and I'm just thinking that comes to the surface, at least for me, as more of a discourse of experience, whether or not these people have actually come in contact with one another. Social network theorists sometimes use language of weak links to talk about people like Paul who connect different groups of people and like transfer ideas and things like that. It's not clear to me that these groups really are connected, though, in any kind of meaningful way, other than the movement of Paul and his companions back and forth. And I think this is why, in some ways, it's hard for Paul to get these people to raise money to send back to Jerusalem, because there's no problem in raising money for local circumstances and associations. But why would you send it to another group? That seems to be an odd thing. So I think he's trying to impose a kind of broader horizon on them. And I think that this common experience language, and there's probably more than simply a discourse of suffering. I mean, I know there's more. I just was looking at it in this paper. But it sort of struck me as that's a commonality among his letters, in a way that the things that we often think are the normal features of a Christ group don't necessarily seem to be. So, thank you.
It's very convincing. I just think the zero being like all that.
Yeah, I like competitive suffering.
This comes out very clearly in texts like Martyrdom of Polycarp, where it's not just competitive death, or like the martyrdom is the pinnacle of death, but it starts, what it's competing with is life. I think that's the text where it speaks of the martyr as anxious, anxious to die. I can't remember the exact text, but it's clear in Martyrdom of Polycarp that he's pretty jazzed about the whole thing.
Yeah, and Paul is definitely a competitive sufferer, because when you look at how he compares himself to the other apostles, oh, they've been beat, I received more beatings, this sort of thing. And then when you get to Ignatius, of course, as well, he just can't wait to be ground up by the lion's mouth, or the leopard, cat.
Scott.
For Sarah, I know you're dealing with Paul, but I wonder if you had brought in the Deutero-Paulines, like the Timothean correspondence, where he talks about anyone who wants to live a godly life will be persecuted, and that identity forming idea of suffering.
I'm not sure what to make of that, because my sense is that those later letters, the social networks are starting to shift upwards. We talked about registers earlier. I mean, certainly by the time you get to 1 Timothy or something, where I think we're in a more kind of elite, not super elite, but we're not in trade groups or anything like that. We're in a sort of higher level of people who want to present themselves as ideal citizens. So, I mean, I think what starts to happen in, if I could say Christianity as a whole, is that persecution just takes on a life of its own. Even today, people talk about being persecuted when it's not happening. Like the war on Christmas. I
thought you were going this direction.
Yeah, this is not happening, right? But yet they're being encouraged to put a interpretive stamp on it by people like Paul, right? Evangelical preachers, things like that. So maybe they're just pulling on this language that seems to be everywhere in the early tradition. And it's not just persecution, it's affliction and hardship and revelation as language of endurance. So it's all over. And so it's being a cultural resource that can, I think, be applied to a lot of different scenarios for people. So,
Joan and then John.
Yeah, just, thinking to link your two papers, Paul's writings were read in successive generations by people that knew he was beheaded. So Eusebius's tradition, all of this language rampage of violence and persecution ends, according to Christian memory at least, with this ghastly result for Paul, with Peter crucified upside down and Paul beheaded.
Which is, in a way, the upside down crucifixion. It's not quite competitive suffering, but it's a realization that there are different levels of suffering, and you don't want to take away from what should be the best.
Yeah, Paul is a Roman citizen. He doesn't get the horrific upside down crucifixion. That's Peter as the foreigner. So maybe there's something still the idea of Paul was spared the worst, but he was still horribly killed.
It was a really good move by the organizer to put these papers together.
Wow, we should praise him.
Thanks, Sarah. I wanted to quibble a little bit with something and then a comment.
Okay.
So when you talked about baptism and the communal meal, you said in both cases that the Corinthians had misunderstood this.
Yeah.
That's Paul's imagination of what happened. But, if you look at 1 Corinthians, the information that he's received comes in 2 packages. From 7:1 on, it's their letter. Here's the problem, tell us about it. But the baptism Eucharist thing doesn't come from the letters. It comes from rumors that he's heard. And there's no doubt that Paul thinks that they're doing it wrong. The real question is whether they thought they were doing it wrong. And those are, so I think the term misunderstanding already buys into Paul's imagination. I don't think they thought they were doing it wrong at all.
Okay, yeah, I get that. But so let's say he gave the same message to, I don't know, the Galatians or something like this, and was expecting them to do the Lord's Supper, and they thought they were doing it right. I mean, I guess the broader point is that we still have alternative interpretations of these practices.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
That,
Okay,
yeah.
so just the word
there's
misunderstood.
multiple things going on,
Yeah.
but Paul needs to be right always, and so he constructs other people as wrong.
Yeah.
Anyhow.
Fair enough.
But the other comment has to do with endurance of suffering. So I think I absolutely buy this notion of competitive suffering and that it's a way of constructing identity. It's also actually, I think, a way of constructing the triumph of the deity. There's a couple of interesting inscriptions. There's 2 inscriptions that have to do with the coming of Serapis, one to Delos and one to Opus, and eventually Thessaloniki. And both of them involve a narrative where the deities coming to these places provoked opposition
Yeah,
and hardship.
I know the Serapis one. Yeah.
That's right. And that's actually how Paul talks about the coming of Christ to Thessaloniki at the beginning in 1 Thessalonians, and how everybody's heard how you suffered, persecution and so forth. But I think, so the point of that is both to reinforce the community, but it's also to say, look at our deity in spite of problems, in spite of persecution and opposition, the deity prevailed.
Yeah.
And so there's actually 2 layers of what suffering is doing. It's both cementing the identity of the partisans, but it's also a way of saying, here's what the deity did. I think that's part of the Maccabean narrative too. So Eleazar gets horribly tortured, but the point is that the Judean deity actually prevailed.
Yeah, it's a victory.
And so I think that's a part of the mix as